once more, for it is hard to be finite upon an infinite subject, and all subjects are infinite. By some people, this entire scrawl of mine may be esteemed altogether unnecessary, inasmuch as years ago, they may say, we found out the rich and rare stuff in this Hawthorne, whom you now parade forth as if only yourself were the discoverer of this Portuguese diamond in our literature. But even granting all this, and adding to it the assumption that the books of Hawthorne have sold by the 5,000, what does that signify? They should be sold by the 100,000, and read by the million, and admired by everyone who is capable of admiration. Okay, welcome everybody to PequodPod. Today we are using the royal we, it's just me, Meg, but we are interviewing one of the sparkling stars of the romantic academic scene, the Dr. Mark Noble, who is going to help us parse the dedication to our beloved Moby-Dick, which is dedicated to someone called Nathaniel Hawthorne. We are here to learn, who is this person? Why did he warrant pride of place at the beginning of this thing? What's fun to know about this relationship? Who's out there? What could we read next? What is the tea, etc.? So, Mark, I would love to kind of hear, who are you? We've met, but for the audio space. And then how did you kind of come to love this time period, and kind of what interests you most about that space as a reader in 2026?
Yeah, fascinating question. Thank you for having me. This is fun. I work on 19th century American lit. I came to American Romanticism in graduate school, as people do through their comprehensive exam reading list. I thought I'd sort of work on later texts as I got started. I sort of got pulled into the early U.S. writing and this sort of moment in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s that began to fascinate me. And then I got a job in which I was assigned to teach Moby-Dick, among other materials from that period, and have been sort of obsessed, in particular with the pedagogical challenge of bringing Moby-Dick into focus over several weeks in front of a group full of undergraduates. And my interest in Thoreau's and Emerson's journal writing, in particular, and science writing from the 1850s, sort of deepened my understanding of this literary scene a little. I don't tend to work too much on like biographical scholarship, but there's a certain coterie of thinkers here, including Melville and Hawthorne, that one can't but kind of sort of become interested in as a scene. Or one can't but be interested in the scene that surrounds their work.
Yeah, almost like the Beats, kind of, in a way. Like the idea is that they all knew each other and were writing in response to what the other was writing, and
some of
in
that.
deference or in competition to,
some rivalries, some cranky personalities, and some sort of arduous attachments here and there that become sort of intriguing. So we're focused on the dedication to Hawthorne.
Indeed, yes, yeah. I think the dedication, it's interesting because I think most Americans would see the name Nathaniel Hawthorne and go, oh, he wrote the Scarlet Letter, which we may or may not have been forced to read in high school. I feel like that's one of the sort of archetypal, I had to read this in high school and it was against my will. And then if we did read it, or if we didn't read it but we just know about it, it kind of ends there.
Yeah. All right, let's start with Hawthorne then, before Melville meets him in 1850, I suppose. So unlike Melville, Hawthorne's a sort of more established New England figure. He famously changes the spelling of his last name to distinguish himself from his, great-great-grandfather, who presided over the Salem witch trials at the end of the 17th century. And Hawthorne carries
That's high New England Gothic, then.
It is, right. I mean, Hawthorne, throughout his life carries this sort of anxiety or sort of guilt about that legacy. And then, the Scarlet Letter, along with several pieces of short fiction set in the 17th century, kind of address that. We can talk a little about So unlike Melville, who, spends his youth running around, Hawthorne's kind of anchored to Massachusetts and sees himself, I think, as a kind of literary star in the making. He publishes his first novel, which is sort of like a campus novel about his college life in 1828, anonymously, and it's sort of a failure that compels him to shift to writing short fiction, the tales written in the 1830s and 40s, for which he's most famous, and which we often teach when we're not teaching the Scarlet Letter, so like Young Goodman Brown or The Minister's Black Veil. He collects those into two really well-regarded collections. The first, Twice Told Tales, is published in, I'm going to get some of these details wrong probably, but I think 1837, and Mosses from an Old Manse, then in 1846. They're fantastic, weird, kind of challenging tales. The thing I often say in classes is that, there's an allegorical sort of moral to the story aspect of Hawthorne's tale writing that can be sort of deceptive in curious ways. It'll often seem like, say, at the end of a story like The Birthmark, in which a kind of pseudo-scientist kills his wife while trying to remove this sort of one blemish on her physical appearance, revealing that said blemish is sort of intrinsic to her or tied to her soul in some sort of way. And the story will end with this kind of moral about the hubris of scientific overreach, while at the same time lacing the story with a series of other sort of subtler, stranger elements. The birthmark stands for femininity or menstruation in some sense that the story hints at but never quite delivers. Or maybe it's actually most interested in a kind of question about how the surface and depth relation that the sort of pull the, flaw out of the body idea might operate, or whether it's reliable. So often in Hawthorne's tales, there's this kind of moral/counter-moral relation that I think must have been part of what provoked Melville. We see a lot of that similar kind of ambivalence or ambiguity about how meaning happens in Melville's writing in the 1850s. Hawthorne publishes The Scarlet Letter, so technically his second novel, but the first novel he publishes with his own name, and the first novel that he writes that achieves any success, in March of 1850. And it causes a bit of a stir in and around New England. It's slightly scandalous for its accounts of sexuality, as you know if you've read it, and it's sort of subtler critiques of Christianity. He then continues writing novels throughout the 1850s. The Blithedale Romance and The House of Seven Gables, which follow, are more complex. Maybe not quite as gorgeous and lyrical as The Scarlet Letter, but sort of richer in their accounts of American social life. He decamps to England for a post offered to him after the election of his friend Pierce in 1852. And then spends most of the latter half of the decade in Europe, publishes his last novel, The Marble Faun, in 1860. So it's really two bodies of work for me, thinking about it certainly as a teacher. These four major novels, all written during the 1850s on the one hand, and then this sort of varied and complicated body of short fiction compiled across a series of collections on the other hand.
He has all these themes that sound like they would be really kind of popular today. Like the inside mirroring the outside, a story sort of where the allegory is I tried to fix my nose and then turn out my soul died. But it seems because he was writing in kind of that allegorical fashion where it seems that, oh, we get it. This is easy, quote unquote, easy to teach. That would make it kind of less fashionable to our contemporary readers. Whereas if maybe now we're kind of more interested in authors who really layer it on in deep ambiguity, or the theme is kind of harder to get to, is a little more popular now. That might be some of the reason why he's kind of maybe thought of as more stodgy, perhaps unfairly, when it sounds like he was doing odd things narratively in kind of the way that we think. When we think of, the way that some of these authors were innovating writing, not just writing interesting stories, but like the way that they wrote was strange. He seems to kind of be not quite let into that club of like cool kids of sort of like the Enlightenment or the Romantic era in America. But do you think that that's fair, like aesthetically? Is there a strangeness where if we like that in other places, we could find that in his stories as well?
Yeah, I mean, among literary critics, Hawthorne's doing fine. I think he gets about the respect he probably deserves. I don't know about the wider readership. Undergraduate students enjoy these tales, but they need to be pushed to think critically about what lies beneath the surface, or certainly beneath the sort of didactic claims that the tales often seem to be making. So like The Minister's Black Veil is a good example and easy to summarize quickly. It's the late 17th century or something. It's not specific. And Parson Hooper shows up one day wearing a veil over his face and freaks out all of his parishioners, who then spend the rest of the story gossiping about what it signifies. So he must be, in other words, representing a specific sin that he committed, some adultery, or some hidden truth. Even his fiancée begs him to remove the veil, and he keeps refusing. At the end of the story, he's on his deathbed, and they're once more imploring him to lift the veil and confess his sin, whatever the veil is meant to signify. And he has this famous moment. He looks around the room and says, I see a veil on everyone's face. And then when I realize someday, hypothetically, that we've all sort of removed our invisible interior veils and, healthily bared our souls to one another the way a Christian congregation is supposed to in the 17th century in New England, then the veil will no longer have served its purpose. So it's a kind of like the camera turns at the end of the story onto the crowd and reveals the veil has been a kind of teachable moment the whole time.
Are we not all wearing veils?
Right. It's like New England Congregationalism in the sort of early colonial period, and then to a different degree, the sort of in the early decades of the 19th century, which Hawthorne's raised in, is sort of grounded in this idea that the community has a sort of transparency about it. You're admitted as a full member of the church by way of this elaborate process in which you do confess all of your sins to the congregation as a whole. Which even sometimes reads like a little bit of like cognitive restructuring. It's weird. And so Parson Hooper is illustrating that that's a sort of a conceit to which we don't really hold, or it's like an hypocrisy intrinsic to social relationship in this scene. And that's the sort of didactic claim the story makes. I think what's interesting about reading it carefully, and Hawthorne is sort of a really deft sentence writer who will lace the whole thing with these little complexities and strange elements. It's not really clear this is a good heuristic practice that the minister is offering. It doesn't actually address its problem. No one really ever understands him. Or maybe the question that often comes up, as suggested maybe similarly in The Birthmark, is about whether symbols or signs of things on the outside of, let's say, the body in this case, can actually signify adequately, can teach us or show us something true about what's hidden or what can't be revealed or what is typically concealed, certainly in our social lives. And the story then, I think, like a lot of these tales, doesn't really arrive at a kind of discernible moral or truth claim about that problem so much as kind of stage it in ever more kind of vexing ways. But within the allegorical container of the short tale that at least structurally seems like it's pointing to a specific kind of, moral imperative or claim about how life happens. And I keep finding these in these tales, right? This sort of official moral of the story, and then upon closer examination, or if one spends a little bit of time in a classroom kind of talking about what we think, a kind of counter-moral or underlying element. It seems to me, having read a lot of Melville, that he must have enjoyed or been drawn to that kind of intermixture of the sort of dubious and the didactic, or the illuminating and the enshrouding elements of Hawthorne's story, and the refusal to kind of neatly separate them.
It sounds like you said that like Hawthorne's stories were kind of scandalous. It seems like because people did understand them.
Sometimes, yeah.
Versus kind of the momentum of Melville's kind of like oeuvre, which is that he kind of became scandalous because people couldn't understand him, and eventually he just stopped publishing things. So it's interesting to sort of hear you talk about these things that kind of like I'm recognizing as themes across both of their bodies of work. Which is often, or which some of which seem to be kind of like, can we trust the outside to be accurately representing what I could learn about a person's inside? But the ways they went about doing that rhetorically were so seemingly different that it might take a while to kind of arrive at that point.
That's for sure true.
But the men themselves were indeed interested in some of those themes. Is that... Are those kinds of things that you see in other writers of the time as well? Was that kind of an anxiety of the middle of the 19th century? Like that we are all so veiled, this is causing problems? Like, do we see this even outside the relationship between these two writers?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I see a similar sort of technique for managing uncertainty about like surface and essence in Margaret Fuller's writing. Hawthorne owes some of his success to Fuller's endorsement of his work in the early 1840s. I think in a lot of ways they do both draw on the sorts of questions and philosophical orientations that New England so-called transcendentalism and the sort of Lyceum circuit that Hawthorne also participates in, developed. I do think there's a kind of, philosophically, there's a sort of spiciness to this play with form and allegory in Hawthorne that I don't think is terribly common. These are allegorical tales that seem to be staging something like the limits of allegory itself, or coming up against their own sort of representative boundaries. It's hard to locate writing from this period that's as formally experimental as Melville's, while similarly engaged with these questions. I do think looking at Hawthorne's later novels, we do find a kind of like more familiar formal shape that would have looked like other materials from the period. Melville, though, throughout the 1850s just gets weirder and weirder until by the end of the decade, he's writing things that no one really can sort of comprehend or grasp or locate in any specific tradition.
Still a problem, yes.
And it was, it would be left to the 20th century to sort out what was going on, certainly after,
cool.
1855. Hawthorne was more famous by the time they met. Never as famous as he thought he should be.
Ain't that always the way?
This kind of cranky affect, conservative politics, unfortunate views about women writers of the period. He's sort of just often described as sort of brooding and shy and melancholic. But I think one gets the sense, both from his own correspondence and those descriptions, that also quite full of himself. So there's this story about their meeting in the summer, August, I think it is, of 1850, in which Melville and his wife, Lizzie, and a handful of other sort of literati, Oliver Wendell Holmes, the poet Sarah Morwood, with whom Melville might have also had a relationship in the following years. Cornelius Matthews is there. Hawthorne arrives, and Melville's editor, publisher, Everett Dykink. Hawthorne arrives without his wife, for like a week of partying and picnicking in the Berkshires with friends. And as the story goes, Melville's immediately smitten. The Scarlet Letter, though, has appeared in March of the same year, but my understanding, looking back to biography, is that Melville had not read the Scarlet Letter at this point, and had read some of the short tales published in 1837 and 1846. And the story goes, they're off on a picnic, the group, and a thunderstorm compels Melville and Hawthorne to sort of hide out in a cave or on some cliffs for several hours, at which point they bond. And some of the prose would suggest Melville actually just really swoons over this older, handsomer, somewhat more famous, and I think even more sort of spicily melancholic writer.
It's very, yes, kind of Byronic almost, like the thunderstorm, the cave. That's just what happens in the Berkshires. Who knows?
Yeah, I assume that's what happens in the Berkshires. Sounds like it anyway, certainly in the 18th.
Yeah, it fits in kind of the puzzle piece in my mind of the thing that can happen. Yeah, exactly.
Melville then is given a copy of Mosses from an Old Manse, the 1846 story collection by Hawthorne. And then like 2 weeks later, a review appears, published by Diakane, in which it's like a 7,000-word account of how Hawthorne is basically Shakespeare for the U.S. And so a lot of the sort of best quotes, I suppose, describing Melville's affinity for Hawthorne, the person, can be pulled from this review. I honestly don't think it's a terribly effective review or like great account of those tales. Mostly just so gushing in page after page about Hawthorne's genius. And we can jump to that maybe in a minute. The story then unfolds where this is a really pivotal moment in Melville's life. He's maybe, I don't know what portion of the way through Moby-Dick at this point, but it's been developed.
Sure.
And I think at this point he's got a somewhat sort of happier ending in mind, or maybe a more conventional sort of novel. And there are suggestions that Hawthorne, along with Morwood, sort of pushes him to the darker, stranger version of Moby-Dick, with which you're familiar. Moby-Dick is then published about a year later in September of 1851. And of course, famously, Melville expects it to be successful, and it's not. Hawthorne claims to like it, but it's not well reviewed. In that intervening year, and shortly after meeting Hawthorne, Morwood, and others in the Berkshires, Melville decides to uproot his family from Manhattan and move out there. So this is like a big jump to the suburbs. I mean, really, the distant exurbs from Manhattan. He borrows against his wife's inheritance. His wife's the daughter of the Massachusetts Supreme Court Justice Lemuel Shaw. And they buy a little homestead in the Berkshires, 5 miles, something like that, from where Hawthorne lives. So there's been a lot of critical speculation that Melville's actually leaves New York City, moves to the country to be near Hawthorne. Ironically, then Hawthorne leaves a couple years later, claiming he never liked living in the Berkshires, and he's off to go on this adventure to Europe. But they do spend some time, and there are 10 letters in Melville's hand written to Hawthorne, which are quite arduous in some cases. My read on that correspondence is that Hawthorne's a little less into the relationship, but they certainly do seem to admire each other and their work. So there's this really interesting set of questions, I guess, there, knowing that story, about how much Hawthorne's influence shapes Moby-Dick. Melville does read the Scarlet Letter in the next year or so, as I recall. But my interest has always been in how some of those tales might offer the text he was reviewing, right, during that year when he was also writing Moby-Dick.
Yeah.
Might offer kind of analogs to or ways into moments in Moby-Dick that resonate with them. And then I think really that's the end of their relationship. They correspond a little throughout the 50s. Hawthorne returns to the U.S. in 1860 or 1861, I can't recall, right, as the war breaks out. And I don't think beyond that there's a whole lot of correspondence between them. A lot of scholarship, though.
Yeah, we would fill the gap, for sure.
Yeah.
He seems to dedicate the book to him less about the things he had written and more about the person that he is, more about the person that Hawthorne is to Melville. But it does sound like you were talking that maybe reading the things that he wrote, or sort of at least those early works, that seemed to opened Melville's kind of aesthetic mind to the possibilities of having that stranger, darker ending, or more rhetorical weirdness, even if Hawthorne himself didn't necessarily write those. I think a lot of people who are writers could point to one or two other novelists or what have you that just kind of oh, I didn't know you could do that. and you don't necessarily copy that thing, but then that just sort of like the giddiness of realizing that you can talk about things in like the stranger way or go over left or right, and your own work kind of opens exponentially as a result. So yeah, I mean, maybe our biggest question would just be, well, why did he dedicate this giant thing to him? At least at the moment, he was incredibly personally important to Melville.
Yeah, it's a fun puzzle for that reason. There's a lot of sort of juicy biographical material to chew on. I was rereading this review of Mosses from an Old Manse this morning, thinking I was going to find more of the kind of critical insight on Melville's part that would lead me to a kind of clearer sense of here's the way this story influences this moment of Moby-Dick or something like that. In a way, I'm glad it's not there because it's, gives me work to do, or us work to do, thinking through the relation. But there are moments in that review which is just very odd in several ways that do kind of maybe point in the direction of certain features of Moby-Dick that the podcast is going to work its way through in the coming weeks. There's this weird element in the use of a pseudonym. So the review is called Hawthorne and His Mosses, appears in the middle of August of 1850. Not by Melville, by a Virginian spending July in Vermont, which is a strange appellation. Melville's not a Virginian. They weren't spending time in Vermont. So it's just an odd pseudonym.
He's got to hide himself.
And maybe this was Everett Duyking protecting Melville at some level. Maybe this was Melville kind of trying to mess with Hawthorne or remain anonymous.
Maybe he just liked the alliteration.
But it opens with this just like blazon to Hawthorne's personhood. It's weird how gushing he is. Even, in reviews, in the 1850s, did sometimes look like this. This one, though, seems particularly affectionate. Right? He describes Hawthorne in the opening as a man of a deep and noble nature has seized me in this seclusion, as described in the experience of reading the book. His wild witch voice rings through me, or in softer cadences, I seem to hear it in the song of the hillside birds that sing in the larch trees at my window. And he goes on, this is a collection of short stories that doesn't really begin discussing in any kind of detail for another 1,000 words or so. He spends about half of the review on Shakespeare, trying to align Shakespeare's reputation, Shakespeare's body of work, with Hawthorne's emerging reputation. Hawthorne's produced one novel at this point, and maybe 40 tales. And then returns later in the review to an account of how a kind of darker side to Hawthorne's work animates his attachment to it. And it's there that I feel like maybe we get a sense of how this response to those tales, or certain elements of their composition and allegorical framing, might have been animating Melville's thinking. But then he turns back at the end of the review to sort of more of the gushing account of how Hawthorne should become, or must become, a kind of signal American writer who would stand for American fiction writing in the way that Shakespeare would stand for the English canon in the imagination of the American 1850s. A little ironic in some ways, because it's maybe more like Melville who becomes that figure when he's recovered in the 1930s and 40s by literary critics. But he very much positions Hawthorne in that way throughout this review. So, I don't know. I'm not sure what I think about the sort of literary merits of his reading, or the critical merits of his reading of Hawthorne, but his enthusiasm is clearly on display in a way that borders on Ishmaelian at times, that I find kind of fun.
Yeah, I like thinking about him as like a young writer sort of discovering his taste, discovering sort of the tendrils of what he likes to read, and then sort of the like reverberations in his own work about how he wants to write about the stuff he wants to write about. If we were to read the whole novel with these kind of like Hawthorne tinted glasses, do you think we would see a lot? Or is it mostly, you just have to believe us that he read Hawthorne stuff early on and was influenced by it, but he wrote it in a completely different way?
I mean, let's try out a few examples, maybe. One of the stories in Moss's From an Old Manse that Melville acknowledges in the review, and which is, I don't know, maybe one of the better stories, is this Rappaccini's daughter. I don't know if we read this together in the past or not. I can't remember.
Does this have the plant monster in it?
Yes, and
yes.
It's a relatively straightforward plot, which I won't spoil the end of. It's not really necessary. Protagonist is a medical student who moves to town and rents an apartment overlooking a beautiful garden, which contains a mysterious, beautiful woman. We learn over the course of the story that both the garden and the woman are poisonous and corporeally sort of tainted, and that the beauty and the poison are inextricable from one another.
Sounds like a Hawthorne joint.
Yeah, it's a sort of Garden of Eden allegory. It's certainly playing with like gender norms and politics and anxieties about sexuality. And, you know, to track the allegorical significance of the story or its so-called moral, we read through the end. I might have to spoil that, actually. I don't know. But here's a passage that's, like, really interesting, right? So that sounds Melvillian with respect to its interest in a kind of ambiguity about where the truth resides or how meaning and truth are organized in and by a corporeal body. Giovanni's looking down at the garden and sort of noticing, it's gradually dawning on him that something's odd, and eventually the poison will contaminate him as well. But he's trying to understand what the feeling he has means, I guess, and how it coordinates with the mysterious elements that he's observing. So whether or not this is Hawthorne, Beatrice possessed those terrible attributes, that fatal breath, aside, she breathes on things and they die. That fatal breath, the affinity with those so beautiful and deadly flowers which were indicated by what Giovanni had witnessed, she had at least instilled a fierce and subtle poison into his system. Breaking again, poison right here is literal, and it's this sort of figurative poison that is infatuation. It was not love, this is Hawthorne again, although her rich beauty was a madness to him, nor horror, even while he fancied her spirit to be imbued with the same baneful essence that seemed to pervade her physical frame, but a wild offspring of both love and horror that had each parent in it, and burned like one, and shivered like the other. Giovanni knew not what to dread, still less did he know what to hope, yet hope and dread kept a continual warfare in his breast, alternately vanquishing one another and starting up afresh to renew the contest. Blessed are all simple emotions, be they dark or bright. It is the lurid intermixture of the two that produces the illuminating blaze of the infernal regions. So on the one hand, I think they notice is like this sentence writing technique feels like a lot of the moments in Moby-Dick and in other prose from the early 1850s by Melville, in which the sort of like, you know, full investment in an elaborate, romantic, kind of almost like Baroque sentence craft takes the stage. Hawthorne's really, I think, a master of that in this period. Melville pushes that technique, I think, further. The use of the word lurid in that last phrase, intermixture of the two, the light and the dark, feels too kind of like a Melvillian move to make the philosophical claim a little sexier. It's distributed throughout the body or understood as a corporeal or physical problem or experience. I think the difference starts to come into focus when one thinks about how in Hawthorne, these kinds of questions, can you tell the difference between love and dread when the two experiences mingle? Or is that mingling, in fact, the experience we're trying to name? In Hawthorne, those kinds of questions are usually framed, as they are in this story, by some kind of, as we suggested, like tale structure or social organization that frames the moral or ethical quandary, as the later novels would suggest. At the same time, there's this fascination with the question of like how bodies mean, or what makes a person legible in any sense, whether the signs on the outside of the body, in other words, as we were suggesting earlier, can be read as indices of what's beneath or what's hidden or what's true. So the stories want to frame that question in Hawthorne. I think Melville takes a similar set of questions. Can the features of the body's whale be read adequately?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. I was going to say there are two very famous bodies in Moby-Dick's, the white whale and then Ahab with his leg.
Right.
So clearly that's something he's interested in studying for the whole book.
Yeah,
And Queequeg, I suppose, and his tattoos. Sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
That seems right. Queequeg's tattoos, the body of the whale, Ishmael's body, the body of the Pequod in a way, like so full of signifiers and elements that want to be discerned and read, corporealized but also interpreted. I think Melville takes this kind of like hermeneutic challenge, this problem with interpretation. Can we read our own experience, our own feelings, the signs on other people's bodies, the signs that are other people's bodies and experiences, the things they say and write? Can we see through them to some, I don't know, lower substrate?
Or is that folly? Yeah.
Yeah. Or when we try to do that, do we rather reveal, I don't know, a larger problem with interpretation or understanding that links all these bodies?
Yeah, that's cool.
You know, I think Hawthorne develops for Melville a kind of way of posing this question that a novel like Moby-Dick then pushes past the range in which Hawthorne would consider that question posable or answerable. So that, as you guys will no doubt sort of encounter, there's so many moments in Moby-Dick in which like bodies bleed out of and into one another, in which the sort of corporeal limits and boundaries that one's trying to discern or use to discern what might lie beneath the surface lead to an even weirder intermixture, to use Hawthorne's term, of elements, corporeal and non-corporeal, physical and non-physical, human and non-human. So I guess I feel like there's this staging of a problem with how we read and understand what the things we see, touch, feel, signify, developed by Hawthorne in these short tales, and then pressed by Melville into a more avant-garde and experimental mode in Moby-Dick. But that's kind of my take on it, and that's really not what Melville thinks he's saying when he's reviewing Hawthorne so enthusiastically in 1850. But he does kind of notice this darkness. In spite of all the sunlight on the hither side of Hawthorne's soul, this is back in that review, the other side, like the dark half of the physical sphere, is shrouded in a blackness 10 times black. But this darkness but gives more effect to the ever-moving dawn that forever advances through it and circumnavigates his world. Whether Hawthorne has simply availed himself of this mystical blackness as a means to the wondrous effects he makes it to produce in his lights and shades, or whether there really lurks in him, perhaps unknown to himself, a touch of the puritanic gloom, this I cannot altogether tell. That question seems like a useful way of characterizing Hawthorne, if not the sort of deepest, but it really does seem to characterize elements of Melville's thinking in the 1850s, in which the question about like how much leaning into the darker elements, let's call them, on display in Moby-Dick, reflects a kind of like state of things, a kind of, I suppose, dark romantic or gothic attachment to the version of the world in which a monster is always about to jump out of the ocean and bite your leg off. Or, on the other hand, the sense that that kind of gothic performativity is a technique or a device for revealing something, say, about the social world, or maybe sort of elements of character the novel wants to explore. And I think in the case of Hawthorne's writing, for the most part, that's the case. The Gothic aesthetics, for instance, have a kind of use value for interrogating early U.S. history or colonial American history, for thinking about social relationship, religious doctrine, politics, and so on. Melville is interested in all of that, as you'll see, he also, though, I think, has a kind of, I don't know, philosophical intensity that pushes this Hawthorne technique to different places.
Yeah, it sounds like, this is so interesting, like it sounds like citing some of this review that he wrote is less about just the stories and more about how thrilling it was for him to read Hawthorne as like a portal into this, it's sort of like this like wormhole, and then you come out the other side, and so it sounds like when you're saying that if we kind of think that obviously there are differences, but there is kind of like a soup that they're both interested in, and for Hawthorne the best way to write about that, the most useful way, the thing that had tropes that interested him in the kind of characters he could do, kind of that allegorical like bow at the end, was in these shorter capital G like Gothic tales. He kind of like the recognizable thing, the strong sense of place. He knew his neighbor would understand the story. Like those things interested him as the best container for the way to talk about all the stuff about bodies, etc. And for Melville, somehow in the like mechanics of his mind, that would not necessarily happen to the person next to him, but for him, reading those stories, he said, the best way to talk about these things for me is to go and write the novel that we're reading, which just because it's so much bigger gives us more room, sort of more breathing space to talk about the bodies and what are the risks of interpretation. We start to be able to have options, like we see this interpretation's consequences, and then 50 pages later we get to say this different consequence, and we aren't quite so tied down to the neatness of what must happen to Giovanni in 30 pages and then it has to end. Because we get this sprawling work, and parts of it become like a poem, and parts of it become a textbook, and parts of it become a play, and parts of it become like a song or like a Shakespeare monologue. He is able to attack it in different ways that were not necessarily interesting to Hawthorne, but they're kind of writing out of these same instincts that, for us, hundreds of years later, is so fascinating, and that we can read, look at all the different ways that these men wanted to attack this problem, and can it be interesting for us as writers and readers to kind of think about what are all of our options if we're all interested in the same thing.
Yeah, that's really well put. I think that's right. I mean, I think, Hawthorne would never have imagined that he could write a novel that sprawls the way Moby-Dick does, or that is sort of formally unconstrained. I mean, I think the formal constraints on the tales are in a large part like their engine, right, or what makes them, it gives them their shape and logic, or makes posing these sorts of philosophical questions.
Yeah, it can be really good to like force yourself to write a story that ends in 10 pages, like that has different requirements, that has different pleasures, and I could see, it could be really difficult for a writer who likes to do that to say, write a 600-page novel. That would break down. It might not necessarily be good.
That's a great,
you know what I'm saying?
Creative writing program question for is more in your wheelhouse than mine. Right? It's like you looked at the same philosophical question. If you could locate moments like I'm suggesting, the lurid intermixture of light and dark.
To get me there in 30 pages versus 300 pages.
Right, and locate that in Moby-Dick and ask, like, as a writer, to what degree does the shape of the tale enforce attention to certain techniques or constrain your options? And then why does Melville just eschew all such constraints, or at least appear to, as he develops Moby-Dick? Which is really, try anything, or even the sort of concept of the anatomy as a literary device or technique, right? Taking apart the whale chapter by chapter, would not have seemed, I think, to Hawthorne a plausible, like, device or structure for storytelling. So there's something I think, about Melville's formal experimentation that doesn't have an obvious antecedent or inspiration. But there is a kind of mood that we're describing that does feel very much like of its literary moment, and attached to the kinds of vibes one gets from those Mosses from an Old Manse and Twice Told Tales stories. I do think, we're focused really here on 1850, on this moment in the summer when they meet, and then what happens in the following year. Hawthorne moves out there Melville moves out there to the Berkshires to be near to Hawthorne, maybe to be near to Morewood. It's not really clear. And this is a pivotal kind of moment for him. He's still, I think, in 1850, entertaining the idea that he'll have success with Moby-Dick. So Typee and Omoo didn't make him a ton of money, but they were critical successes. Those are his first two novels. White Jacket and Redburn didn't quite land in the ways he'd hoped, but were also sort of well-reviewed. And the idea here was that Moby-Dick was going to bring Melville back to the sort of status that the publication of Typee had suggested he might achieve. And it's plausible that if he'd composed a more recognizable thing, that if he'd adhered to some of the constraints that Hawthorne understood novels to require of novelists, that he might have had that success because of the sort of maritime adventure.
Yeah, because there was clearly an audience for sort of the thematic sort of subject matter. Signs
of cannibals, signs of sex, whaling. But I think, a lot of, you'll get to this, I suppose, at some point, but, a lot of the early reviews of Moby-Dick didn't get past the homoeroticism in the chapters, in the early chapters. A lot of the reviews didn't get past the sort of sense of the formal disarray that one gets when kind of flipping through the text rather than reading it carefully. And so it's this pivotal moment in Melville's career, and he never really recovers. His following novel, Pierre, is even more of a disaster for all sorts of other reasons. There's some amazing short fiction written during this period. Bartleby the Scrivener, Benito Cereno, the Piazza Tales, and Cantatas. But those two, they don't look a lot like Hawthorne tales. They're sort of not governed by predictable structures, or when they do have a structure, so a story like The Paradise of Bachelors and The Tartarus of Maids is like a diptych structure. It's still even puzzling how to think about the tale as a story, or how to think about the narrative elements. It feels modernist or avant-garde, even when Melville's writing short fiction as well. So I don't know, it's like Hawthorne seems like he arrives in Melville's life as Moby-Dick is being composed, and at this kind of pivotal moment in his personal life, leaves quite a mark on Moby-Dick, or at least that's the invitation is to find that mark. And then I think they sort of part ways, both artistically and personally, after this moment that's been written about so much, in which they're hiding out together in a rainstorm.
The most important rainstorm in American literary history, perhaps.
Certainly one of the better picnic dates, I guess.
I guess, yes. So, it sounds like there's a lot there. I was going to sort of ask if there are anything that a Melville reader would really enjoy reading of the Hawthorne works if she has never dipped her toe there before. Is there anything that, like, as the library expands, a person might be surprised to learn? Again, if the only thing that they know Hawthorne from is just like the reputation of the Scarlet Letter, or if they've seen Easy A starring Emma Stone.
I think everyone should read the Scarlet Letter. It's so funny. I found it tortuous in high school when they made me read it. I can't really remember that adolescent epistemology well enough to sort of think of why that would have been. And then I had to encounter it in graduate school, and I dreaded it, even having read Hawthorne at that point, and was struck by just how gorgeous that novel is. Like, it's really an astonishingly beautiful, sort of troubling short novel that gets sort of we anticipate it too much. Although those adaptations are great as well. So I definitely check that out. Certainly for a sense of like how style operated too in 1850 for these U.S. writers thinking themselves as capital R romanticists.
Yeah.
And then I think I would probably go to the Mosses from an Old Manse collection that Melville reviews in 1850. I think there too you'd find a handful of stories that pull into focus this thing we've been kind of trying to tease out of both Hawthorne and Melville's thinking in this period, which is a question about how representation happens or what art is supposed to do relative to this question about surface and depth, or appearances and then the deeper hidden truths beyond or beneath appearances. So in that collection, The Birthmark is a good kind of intro story. Rappaccini's Daughter, which we discussed, I think sort of builds that question. And then some of the more specific, the stories that seem to be more explicitly about art. Drown's Wooden Image is a sort of Pygmalion rehashing. And then The Artist of the Beautiful is a disturbing and weird story about how art happens. You know, and then in that story like that, which I once summarized, about a guy who invents a mechanical butterfly, which is so beautiful and lifelike that it sort of troubles the boundary between engineering and artistry.
Oh, cool. Kind of uncanny. Well, lastly, I might, unless you have anything, do you have anything else you kind of want to...
I would say that Hawthorne, just for one last point too, is rarely anywhere close to as funny as Melville is in Moby-Dick.
Oh,
and
no,
that'd be an interesting comparative point to sort of draw out while reading them too. I mean, it's not that there aren't moments in Hawthorne that are sort of wickedly hilarious, but they just, especially in those first like 20 or so chapters, which you're in the middle of now in Moby-Dick, but really throughout, there's just a sort of like hilarity to Moby-Dick. And I always wondered what Hawthorne thought of that, you know, or like what any of this sort of like group that surrounded Melville thought about the humor and the sort of playfulness of Moby-Dick. It's not that the Hawthorne tales aren't playful. They're just constrained, I think, by an attachment to sort of conventional form or formal conventions, and you know, there's a conservatism, I guess, about Hawthorne's like story construction that conceals a sort of, as Melville put it, like 10 times black or whatever, darkness or anxiety and uncertainty. But he's just sort of rarely as experimental and well, playful as Moby-Dick often is.
Yeah. It sounds like maybe he was not, he was just not maybe a hilarious person.
No, I think, he's pretty moody. I mean, they both were. Melville has this, well, certainly in Moby-Dick and elsewhere in the early 50s, I don't know, this unusual sense for how like comedy might play within a narrative structure that doesn't rely upon the comedy exactly or isn't built around it. And that's just something to trace in Moby-Dick, that for which I don't see like many analogs in this period. So we'll see what you guys think.
That's an interesting point. I was like, you were saying earlier that like Melville was trying to maybe force this analogy between Hawthorne and Shakespeare, but to us now it's sort of more Melville who we could think of as sort of obviously not a one-to-one, but also like Shakespeare in his tragedies, I think he like invented the idea of like comic relief of like, we're doing, you know, the most horrible things you've ever seen, and then like the police officer comes in and there's a break in tension, and in sort of like you could almost think of some of the formal changes to be moments of like humor, where he may where you can kind of see the, you know, the writer, the hand of God come in and sort of say, and now we're going over here, and like that has to be kind of funny. Sort of thinking about like moments in songs where you think there's like a kind of a joke at work. Yeah, I think that's interesting. Melville definitely, both in his use of like irony, where you think of like kind of like high culture, but also he was capable of kind of like going low and just making like a goofy joke. Yeah. Whether or not we like laugh out loud at that, we can recognize that he's making a joke and kind of just appreciate that. We're kind of the rhythm, again, like you were saying, of this long novel. We need that to ebb and flow, or it's going to feel like a slog. And it seems like he is largely... And again, as the pod moves through this, we'll be able to be a little more specific. But like moments of lightness tempering this really huge, at least Shakespearean novel of like high tragedy, beset by the people who are doing it to themselves, but also like we have moments where just like the sailors are funny, and why do that? Because he can, and that makes it more fun.
Yeah,
and it's helpful for the rhythm for the rhythm.
I do wish I could ask Hawthorne that. Like, what does he think about putting on the whale's penis as a coat and then making a sort of joke about religious vestments out of that, right? Or Queequeg doing obstetrics on the sinking head of the whale. Just like these moments in which the chapter will invite this kind of philosophical reflection or depth that's constructed out of, that is a reflection on its elements, on what's happening, right? As Queequeg is diving after the sinking head of the whale. But then Melville will shift into this humorous or ironic mode that feels like suggests the chapter is taking itself less seriously than it also invites. That lurid intermixture, I guess, of sort of gravity and levity in Moby-Dick is something that would be really interesting to see a writer like Hawthorne or Margaret Fuller or someone sort of like take on or try to explain. But I suppose that's our job now.
That is our job. So my last question, because I'm obviously reading this book again very slowly, but I know it's coming. You have taught it many, many times, are gearing up to possibly do it again. I was just kind of wondering, as you hit this book over and over, and there's so much to it, and you can talk about something different every time, what is your favorite part of Moby-Dick to revisit? Do you have kind of like a pet theme that you like to turn over, or kind of like your own sort of obsessive bent about this novel that's about having an obsessive bent?
You guys want to pick one moment? That's hard. I love this. Was it chapter 44? So right after the whole period, you're going to get. I'm spoiling things that are coming up in the podcast here. So
That's okay. That's okay.
So there's this one amazing day on board the Pequod that begins in the morning with the famous quarterdeck speech in which Ahab sort of summons the crew to his mission, and ends with the same day, which is 9 chapters. Ends in chapter 44 with Ahab starting from his sleep in the middle of the night. And there's this fascinating description that's been read many times by various critics of how the body and the soul are sort of becoming unyoked from one another, that Ahab's monomania, he stayed up too late studying charts, trying to find Moby-Dick in his whaling charts, has sort of like driven an internal thing, an essence of the self, an inner volition or driver to sort of exit the body, or at least that's one way of reading it. And then you've got sort of this story of this happening to Ahab. He flies from his bed as though his soul were on fire. And then you've got Ishmael's kind of take on it, or reading of what it means. And those two things are sort of overlap, but are also maybe a little bit at odds. And it starts to highlight this fascinating question about where the kind of boundaries and limits that fashion the individual self, or maybe even just the corporeal thing that is the body, where those actually lie, and how really stable and or permeable they might be. And from that moment, at the end of that amazing long quarterdeck day, which I would suggest kind of reading as a thing, like a chapters 36 to 44 have this kind of pivotal start the plot element to them. Reading both forward and backward in the novel from that moment has really helped me kind of trace fascinating slippages or accounts of corporeal elements, the whale's body, again, the body is the ship, Ahab's body, etc., Queequeg's body. I guess that helps me track a kind of playfulness in Melville with a question about where the boundaries and limits of the self really lie. And then how much we can, if we look carefully, take apart a body like the whale's body, start to discern the sort of degree to which we kind of bleed into one another, or in which the world is comprised of things that appear to be discrete elements,
right,
but are in fact a kind of indiscrete mix or lurid intermixture, as Hawthorne would have it. corporeal elements. So I have come to sort of see chapter 44 as this kind of moment that offered me a kind of interpretive lens on a lot of those others. I've also been really interested lately in like the labor politics of the Pequod's world. You'll get to a moment in which Ahab raises a gun on Starbuck because Starbuck's insisting they stop their pursuit of Moby-Dick to preserve some of the wealth they've collected. And that's another kind of interesting moment, I think, that leads to a series of questions about how like the laboring bodies on board the Pequod are organized and constituted, what it means that Ahab's able to sort of perform this kind of totalitarian, or offer this kind of like a authoritarian model of how the Pequod should be organized around his volition, his will.
Right.
And then,
but only by consent of the workers.
Right.
All under this kind of imaginary society on the boat. Yeah.
Exactly. Starbuck, on the other hand, has a kind of market-driven understanding of what the whole thing means.
Yes.
And the contest between those, well, maybe kind of like political economy, Starbuck, versus political theology, Ahab, seems to me to kind of spin out from that moment in which the confrontation between them comes to, gunpoint. And that, too, seemed like a cool moment to then track backward and forward in the novel and see what we think about, what Melville might be thinking or saying about political economy in the 1850s, using the Pequod as a kind of microcosm for modernity.
Yeah. And that Starbuck and Ahab thing returns with the musket in one of my favorite chapters, which will take us like 3 years to get to, but when he has that monologue when Ahab is asleep and Starbuck is like, I can end all this right now.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so good. That's one of my favorite parts in like almost any book. That's really remarkable. Something to look forward to. Well, I think we have done something amazing here today, which is to kick off a Hawthorne Renaissance. It's going to happen. It's going to be shocking. We're going to have a hot Hawthorne autumn, is my prediction. Thank you so much for joining me today and lending your wisdom, your interpretation to this interpretive task. And we'll only know in time if we've destroyed part of ourselves by trying to understand something. But at least today, I think we had a good time.
No, this is really fun. Thanks for having me. I'm around. Let's do it again.
You've been listening to the PequodPod with Tristan Bavell-Marquise, Meg Fancher, and Johnny Wiles. Our music is by Lost in the Loop, with sound engineering by Lauren Ayton. The show's artwork is by Delaney Garrett, and Tristan is on the synths. We want to say a big thank you to all of our supporters on Patreon. You can join them over at patreon.com/PequodPod for bonus content and for opportunities to help us keep the show running in ship-shape condition. Ratings and reviews also really help us out, so if you enjoy the show, please do express your thoughts and metaphysical yearnings in the review section wherever you're listening to the show. Tell your friends, tell your foes, tell the white whale on whom you're monomaniacally urged to be revenged. It all helps. Thanks for listening, and until next time, call us the Pequod.